And you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
RT has been pulled from African transmissions. Broadcasts of RT, the former Russia Today, have been pulled over the continent of Africa. While the channel went dark on South Africa's DSTV pay TV bouquet in March last year, there were still transmissions on Starsat and StarTimes for many African countries. How significant of an event is this, and what does it really signal? No pun intended. For insight, we turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
They have now ended with SES blacking out the channel, and SES is prepared to take immediate action and implement any instructions they receive from regulatory authorities. Now those instructions have led to the channel's demise. SES says that it turned the designated signals off per the European sanctions passed on March 2nd of last year, but that Russia Today delivered through its SES-5 satellite was not one that the European Union has banned, and now the China-backed Starsat and StarTime signals of RT went dark on the 24th of February. Dr. Horne, why is this so significant?
It's as obvious as the nose on your face. It's apparent that the North Atlantic countries led by the United States are getting ever more hysterical about the challenge presented to them by China and Russia. And I noted with care your point that this satellite stopping of transmission is fundamentally a Russian-China production. And it also helps to illustrate and illuminate one of the current metaphors of our time. What I mean is that there are a number of pundits and commentators who have suggested that the United States and China, backed by Russia, are in a kind of race right now. Instead of the United States seeking to spend more on education, spend more on daycare, childcare, healthcare, etc., it's seeking to trip its competitors. Or to use another metaphor, it reminds me of a New York Marathon of the 1970s, when you had a competitor named Rosie Ruiz, who instead of racing, took the subway to the finish line and then emerged with her hands held high, saying that she had won. Well, the United States, instead of seeking to compete on an even playing field with China, with Russia, is trying to take shortcuts. It's trying to take a subway train to the finish line. That simply won't work. Rosie Ruiz was exposed, and the United States will be exposed. But I think more than anything else, it might reflect the fact that Africa is a battlefield right now. It's a battlefield because Africans, 4 dozen plus in the African Union and represented the United Nations, comprise a bulk of political capital with regard to voting on issues in the General Assembly of the United Nations. We all know that Africa is awash in natural resources, particularly the energy resources that the United States is now vowing and pledging to boycott with regard to their being taken, or I should say bought from Russia. And so this helps to shed light on why, as we speak, you see French President Macron is touring Gabon, energy-rich, Republic of the Congo, energy-rich, Democratic Republic of the Congo, awash in natural resources, Angola, awash in petroleum. So this particular maneuver by the North Atlantic countries needs to be taken very seriously. And I'm afraid to say that an ultimate loser will be Africans who are deprived of a different point of view that was being delivered by RT and now are more subject to the pernicious propaganda ladled out by the United States and its acolytes.
Speaking of the world being a bit of a battlefield, Secretary Blinken wraps up his Central Asia tour before going to the G20 talks in India. Was doing a tour in Central Asia and Uzbekistan, et cetera. Your thoughts on, clearly he was doing that to, I guess, rile up some anti-Russia sentiment. Your thoughts?
It's going to be very difficult for the United States to compete in what used to be Soviet socialist republics. If you look at Kazakhstan, for example, if you look at the demography, there's a significant Russian-speaking population there. And as well, if you look at Kyrgyzstan, the regime is heavily dependent upon Russia accepting Kyrgyz workers on a regular basis to toil there and send back remittances to their homeland. And if you look at Uzbekistan, for example, you'll quickly note that with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, what happened, I have to say, was utterly predictable, was that China has begun to move into that former Soviet socialist republic. And Mr. Blinken then parachutes in with promises and pledges that hardly can be kept because, number one, the United States has a multi-trillion-dollar debt that it may default on sooner rather than later. And number two, in terms of the military that it's pledging to send, military material that's pledging to send, well, the cupboard is basically bare because basically a lot of the U.S. military material was already pledged to Ukraine. So Mr. Blinken basically is left with the unpleasant reality that he's making empty promises, and empty promises that can hardly be kept.
And to that point, he tells reporters that in Tashkent that the so-called Russian invasion fostered deep concerns across the region. After all, if a powerful country is willing to try to erase the borders of the sovereign neighbor by force, what's to stop it from doing the same to others? Countries across Central Asia understand this. He's telling this trope as though nobody else understands history, as though nobody knows what happened in 1990 when James Baker, negotiated with Gorbachev about NATO not moving 1 inch to the east if Gorbachev allowed for the reunification of Germany. He's saying these things as if nobody knows what's really going on.
Yes, you have to assume that Mr. Blinken thinks that his audience is stupid. He appears as if he's a Philadelphia lawyer talking out of both sides of his mouth, the kind of lawyer who goes into court and tells the judge, Your Honor, my client didn't do it and he won't do it again. That is to say, how can Mr. Blinken credibly make the point about erasing borders and ignoring sovereignty when that has been the hallmark of U.S. imperialism? Just ask the people of Iraq, ask the people of Libya, just to name two in a lengthy laundry list. So Mr. Blinken, to be fair, has a tough brief to argue, but I must say he does not argue it very well.
And let me just quickly add, we know what happened with the Maidan coup in 2014, and we know that Samantha Power just left Hungary. And one can only assume she's trying to foment the same coup.
Well, right next door to Uzbekistan is Kazakhstan. They tried to overthrow that last year. Russian President Vladimir Putin revealed that he is preparing for a meeting with his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping and would try to show the Chinese delegation the Moscow Metro's Bolshaya Kolsevaya line, big circle line, during his visit to the Russian capital. Apparently, they're building some gigantic circle that's like the biggest in the world, 70 miles, I think, or 70 kilometers, excuse me. Pretty incredible.
Subway.
But at any rate, I don't think
underground subway.
But I don't think that's going to be the focus of their conversation. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, this will be an exceedingly profound and important summit that takes place. That is to say that this small planet may be at an inflection point where the hegemony of the North Atlantic countries, which has existed for half a millennium, we're now beginning to see cracks, and we're beginning to see the emergence of a new world order. Not the new world order trumpeted by U.S. President George H.W. Bush 30-odd years ago, but a new world order where China is preeminent and it's flanked on one side by Russia and the other side by the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and supplemented by the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which includes in a fundamental way Iran. And this is the new lineup. This is the new global correlation of forces. This is the kind of reality that the North Atlantic countries are trying to keep away from the African population, so that the African population will feel that they have no alternative but to continue to try to cut deals, one-sided deals, to the advantage of the North Atlantic countries at that. However, that particular setup, I'm afraid to say, is destined for history's dustbin.
And as we look at President Xi and Putin talking about building this subway, I believe China was responsible for building the subway in Iran. And that's a very nice subway. So, final point, India unwilling to condemn Russia, and Lukashenko holds talks in Beijing. This is from TASS. India seeks to avoid condemning Russia at a G20 foreign ministers meeting, and Belarusian President Lukashenko holds talks with the Chinese leadership during a visit to Beijing. And then also you've got the Russian Space Agency planning to cut funding for the International Space Station. Dr. Horne, at every turn, the United States is losing points.
Well, that's a gross understatement. And with regard to Mr. Lukashenko of Belarus, if you identify and scrutinize trade figures, you should pay careful and close attention to trade figures between China and Belarus following this summit in Beijing, because I dare say that trade will escalate, which is totally legitimate. But I'm sure Washington will interpret that as being Belarus being a kind of way station in terms of goods being shipped there and then transited on to Russia. This is the current reality that we face. And with regard to India, the United States only has itself to blame for India's pledge of neutrality. Recall that it was in 1962, in order to score cheap points during the Cold War, that the United States was seeking to encourage China to attack India, because the United States was upset that India would not break with Moscow. Instead of that particular gambit working, you see in 2023 that India still is reluctant to break with Moscow, although I'm afraid to say that the downside of rather complicated China-India relations still persists. And that is something we're going to have to watch carefully, because Washington will seek to worsen that particular antagonism to its narrow benefit.
You know, I was reading an article this morning where one of the deals that they've made, one of the major car makers in China, and China's car makers are really growing, is now going to start, as a result of this, going to start building cars in Belarus. That's going to allow them to get into that market. You've got the new area of Russia, shall we say, there. So this is, in some ways, if it turns out fairly smoothly, is of great benefit to China. And since the U.S. the Western car makers are leaving out of Russia, you've got the Russian, Belarus, that whole area, a new market opening up for China.
Well, not only, quick before you respond, not only a new market, but you've got industrialization, you've got economies of scale,
the parts they need,
and technology.
Yeah.
We could see flying cars coming out of there in another year.
Yeah.
Dr. Horne, we have about a minute.
Well, speaking of cars and speaking of China, keep in mind that Tesla, with Elon Musk, apartheid South African heritage, being the major stockholder there, his particular corporation is heavily dependent upon production and sales in, guess what, the People's Republic of China. So even this alleged star of U.S. monopoly capitalism finds that he too is dependent upon the Chinese market, which makes even more curious that Tuesday evening bipartisan congressional hearing lambasting China in every sphere you could think of, from agriculture to espionage. But the same day in the Wall Street Journal, it reported that McDonald's and Starbucks were in the process of opening scores, if not hundreds, of restaurants in China. Go figure.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.